Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 90. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 20th of October, where you would have handed in your first writing assignment on the paragraph. So I will be reading those and returning them back to you via email. Might take me a little bit of time to get to them, but certainly I will return them before your second formal writing assignment is due. And you can keep in mind as well that you have the option of revising one of your first three assignments over the course of the semester. So that if it turns out that you wanted to earn a higher grade, you could take my comments into account and you could do a revision and hand in the revision along with the evaluated copy, and then you get the higher of the two grades, which I don't think is in any way giving you an unfair advantage, because ultimately this is the way professional writers write. They go through multiple drafts and multiple revisions. But I wanted us to focus on that idea of a well-written paragraph, because that really is the building block to an essay, or also known as a paper. Both words are used in college, and that's what today's reading is about. It's developing an essay. And that was on pages 176 to 200. And basically, an essay is divided up into three sections. You've got a minimum of 3 paragraphs in an essay or a paper. The first is the introductory paragraph. This is where you've got your thesis. This is where you are stating your main point. And then you've got your supporting paragraphs. And the reality is you probably have more than one supporting paragraph, and that's where the length comes in. But at minimum, you would have one supporting paragraph that gives your pieces of evidence. And we've been talking about the idea of 3, to try to hit 3 pieces of evidence or more. And then finally, there is a concluding paragraph. This is where we get closure in a particular essay. Now, keep in mind that each paragraph has to follow the criteria of what we've already established as a paragraph. That it should have a topic sentence, which basically is usually the first sentence that summarizes what the paragraph is about. And then within that paragraph, you've got multiple pieces of evidence and details. And then you've got a concluding sentence that gives closure. And oftentimes, when students are writing a paper or an essay, they find it to be challenging, particularly the introductory paragraph, because they aren't able to get enough length. And they find the concluding paragraph also challenging because they aren't able to get enough length. So keep in mind that your introduction isn't really giving any new pieces of information. It's basically orienting your reader to what it is you are going to be discussing. Likewise, your conclusion doesn't really give any new pieces of information. It basically just restates the major points. And there are techniques that you can use to develop an introduction and develop a conclusion. And we talked a little bit, I believe, about some of them. That you could do something like tell a story. The story has to be related to whatever it is that you happen to be discussing, but that would be a good thing that you could use in an introduction or a conclusion. Or a quotation. And again, the quotation has to be related to what it is that you are talking about in your introduction or your conclusion. But a quotation can be very useful. You could ask questions. The idea is that you answer those questions within the context of your essay. That would be a good way to begin or end a particular essay. You could talk about the opposite thing that you are planning on discussing and then transition into the thing you are discussing. That could be something that you could do in an introduction or conclusion. You can give an overview. So in the introduction, you basically summarize what your entire paper is going to be about. Or you could do that in the conclusion, which is reminding the reader what your entire paper was about. So there's lots of different techniques that you could utilize for an introduction or a conclusion. This is where our next writing assignment will ultimately be headed, though we won't be doing that for several weeks, where we are going to be writing a minimum of 3 paragraphs. And if the 3 paragraphs are well written and detailed, we are probably talking about something in the area of about a page or two, which is usually a very short essay. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get a little bit closer. The text reminded you that you need to think about, whenever you're writing, your audience, or in other words, your readers, who is reading, because you want it to be appropriate for your audience, and the purpose or the reason or the goal why you are writing. You could be writing to inform. This is a very common writing assignment where you are given an essay to show the reader, in this instance, let's say a teacher, that you understand the material. Or it could be to persuade. You are trying to convince the reader to take a particular position. Or it could be to entertain. And it might be a little bit of all three, actually. But thinking about the reason why you are writing a particular essay. So, for instance, when you are writing about an activity that gave you a feeling of accomplishment, you are informing me, the reader, about an activity and why it gives you accomplishment. But chances are you are also trying to persuade me that this activity really did make you feel accomplished. And there's probably some element of entertainment in there, and that you're talking about yourself, so I get to know you a little bit better. So, previewing and editing, one page that you might want to highlight in the text is page 184. And it talks about some of the questions you should ask yourself if you're reading somebody else's writing, or if you are reading your own writing and preparing it to be submitted in. So, for instance, is there a thesis statement? This is the first point that's made on page 184. Or a topic sentence for a paragraph that makes a point. Number 2, do the topic sentences directly relate to the thesis statement? 3, are there ways in the paper, or are there spots in the paper where you see problems with things like unity and sticking to one point, support, the evidence that's given, or organization, the idea that your arguments are connected? Make a note of 2 things that you think are very good about the paper, and also 2 things that you think could be improved about that piece of writing. Look at spots where your reading of the paper snagged. I had suggested that you read your writing out loud, and oftentimes if you're having difficulty reading something out loud, it's probably, or it could be, because of the construction of the sentence that it needs to be improved. And although sentence skills certainly are important, don't just think about the idea of grammar and mechanics, which is why we began the semester not talking about grammar and mechanics, but talking about things like generating ideas and organizing those ideas and drafting and revising. And on page 185 of the textbook, what you can see is a student going through the process of writing a sample essay or a sample paper. The first thing they do, the essay happens to be the topic on self-compassion. And the first thing the student did was to do some pre-writing. So some listing of ideas, and there are quite a few ideas here, not that all of them are going to be used. And then she organized the ideas that she thought she wanted to use into categories. And we see that initially when she's listing ideas for self-compassion. She's thinking about dreams and goals and loving yourself and self-esteem and mentoring and self-love and honesty and not giving up and self-confidence. And then what she does is she organizes some of those. So the idea of treating yourself well and being true to yourself, making yourself happy and loving others and making them happy. And then other things that she organizes, some of the challenges. For instance, accepting others for who they are, or standing up for what you believe in, even if you are standing alone. And so you can see that all of this organization and generating ideas leads to the possibility of being able to come up with something that looks like an outline. For this particular student, she has categories where first she gives a definition of self-image and self-esteem and self-love and honesty. And then there's a section about treating yourself well through meditation, health and fitness, making yourself happy, loving others, making others happy. And then there's another section about being true to yourself, about being able to say no, having confidence, trusting yourself, staying true to yourself, knowing your limits. And then finally, she ends up with challenges, things like accepting others for who they are and being able to forgive and standing up for what you believe in, even when you are alone. So you can see that she does this writing over a period of time until finally what she ends up with is a kind of draft where on page 194, there are lots of edits that are made. Places where she wants to change things around. It could be that It could be grammatical, but it could be based on organization, or it could be based on content. So you can see that there are lots of elements that go into actually writing a paper until finally it's ready to be submitted in. And this is what we see on page 198, the actual finished copy, which is about steps to self-compassion. But it took her it took this student lots of tries before they got to that particular point. So think about that as you're doing your own writing. As we move forward to talk about grammar, and we were talking last class about one of the most common sentence errors that a writer can commit, a sentence fragment. That is an incomplete sentence. So a sentence that does not express a complete thought. It could be because it's missing a verb in action. So saying something like I home has no action. That is a fragment. It's missing a verb. What did you do in terms of home? Or it could be that it's missing a subject. So it could be that you've got a sentence like walked home. And the question is who or what walked? So you don't have the subject of the sentence. The subject is a noun, a person, place, thing, or idea, but it's a very specialized noun. It's about who or what is performing the action. Or you could have a sentence that has a subject and a verb, but it still doesn't express a complete thought, usually because it begins with something known as a dependent word, a word that's dependent on additional information. For instance, saying something like, because I walked home. Well, because you walked home, what happened? So then you need to give additional information. Because I walked home, I didn't have to pay bus fare, or whatever the case may happen to be. Now, the fragment is, as I said, a very common error. Another very common error is known as a run-on. Sometimes it's called a fused sentence as well. And that is our reading for on page 495 to 504. A run-on, the definition for that is basically two complete thoughts, or in other words, two complete sentences, because a sentence is basically a complete thought, that are run together without dividing punctuation. The dividing punctuation is the period. This is what we use to divide up one sentence from another, or to separate one sentence from another. And you can see in the notes below in section 6, I've given an example of two very simple sentences. I've been working with simple sentences just to give you an idea of these grammatical errors, and then we'll move to more complex sentences as the semester progresses. The example is, I went home, I went to work. Or the example is, I went home, then I went to work. And we have two sentences here, basically. I went home is one sentence. Then I went to work is another sentence. But these sentences are run together with no dividing punctuation. So this is what is known as a run-on or a fused sentence. Now, there is another error that is called a comma splice. It's like a run-on, but it is such a common error, it gets its own name, that you are using a comma to splice apart, to basically separate two complete sentences. You can't do that. When you're splicing something, you take it apart and then you try to put it back together again. So basically, two complete thoughts or sentences run together, only with the comma dividing up those sentences. So we'll take those simple sentences again. I went home, then I went to work. So the example you can see in section 7 is I went home, comma, then I went to work. That is known as a comma splice. I would circle that comma and identify it as a comma splice, that you are using a comma to separate two complete sentences. It's a very common error because most people can usually hear where there's a pause between two complete sentences. But the comma alone cannot separate two complete sentences. What should be there, the easiest way to correct this, is using a period and then a capital letter for the next sentence. And you can see this in section 8 where I've got suggestions for correcting run-ons. Use a period and a capital letter to separate sentences. So the example is, I went home, period. And the next sentence begins with a capital. Then I went to sleep, capital T for then. So that is one way that you could fix a run-on. Or what you can do is continue to use a comma, but you need to use what's known as a joining word. This is known as a conjunction. And you need to memorize these words. There's 6 of them. But, or, yet, so, for, and, nor. But, or, yet, so, for, and, nor. Now, I've given you a technique, a mnemonic technique, a memory technique for memorizing that. It's an acronym. And what an acronym means is that every letter in a word represents something else. And the word that I'm going to give you as the acronym is boys fan. And sometimes I've heard it said fanboys, but the way I learned it was boys fan. So to this day, I still think of a group of boys standing in front of a fan. But nevertheless, every letter in that word stands for one of the joining or connecting words known as conjunctions. In boys fan, the B stands for but. In boys fan, the O stands for or. In boys fan, the Y stands for yet. In boys fan, the S stands for so. In boys fan, the F stands for. In boys fan, the A stands for and in boys fan, the N stands for nor. So again, but, or, yet, so, for, and nor. So that means that you can use a comma to separate two complete sentences if you add one of these connecting words after the comma. Now, I know that these words have different meanings, so you have to select a word that would have the appropriate meaning for your sentence. You can see in the example that I've given you below, again, same two simple sentences. I went home, then I went to work. But you can see that I've got the first sentence, I went home, comma, and then I added one of those conjunctions, but, and then I've got the following sentence. Then I went to work. So you can use a comma, but the comma has to have a conjunction. A comma splice means that you've got a comma separating two complete sentences and there is no conjunction following the comma. Or if you don't want to use a comma, just use a period. That's the easiest way to separate those two sentences. Now, there are other ways to separate as well. And another way actually deals with the piece of punctuation, because very soon we are going to be talking about punctuation. It's something called a semicolon, which is a period on the top and then a comma on the bottom. And what you're using is a semicolon for to separate two complete sentences that are very closely related to one another. And you want to show the relationship between the two. It's almost like drawing an arrow between the two. And again, I'll take those two simple sentences. I went home, then I went to work. And you can see that between these sentences, I went home, being the first sentence, then I went to work, the second sentence. Instead of a period, I've got a semicolon. You can see that the semicolon, the notes below, is a period on top with a comma on the bottom. And that would be a piece of punctuation that you can find on your keyboard. Now, semicolons are used very rarely. So the idea behind a semicolon is that you use it in very rare instances when you want to show a very direct connection between the two ideas. What you should be using regularly is the period. The semicolon you might use once, perhaps twice in a paper, very, very rarely. And again, those two sentences have to be very, very closely connected to one another. But this is a good way to make your writing a little bit more interesting. If you can use a semicolon and use it correctly, because most people do not use semicolons correctly, then you can impress the reader. There are a few other rules for when you would use a semicolon that we will talk about when we get to that piece of punctuation, the semicolon. It's a piece of punctuation that, again, you don't use very frequently. The piece of punctuation that we do use frequently outside of the ending period is the comma. The comma is a long pause. And in fact, the comma is going to get its entire class devoted to that piece of punctuation next class, because the comma leads to so many questions. There are rules for using the comma, which we will talk about. But you can also train your ear to hear where a comma goes. It's usually where people will pause naturally in speech. So if you begin to listen to other people very carefully when they're speaking, you can begin to hear these pauses. Now, you're making these pauses as well when you speak. The problem is that if you're trying to monitor yourself, chances are that you're going to be so self-conscious with your speaking that you're going to be pausing in all kinds of places you normally wouldn't pause. So I suggest that you listen to other people when they are speaking. And when you are reading, you can read out loud and read for the pauses. Take a deliberate pause in the place where a comma appears so that you can begin to train yourself as to where commas should go. But again, I said that that's going to be a class in and of itself, and that's what we are going to be talking about next class, the comma. So if you want to think about the most common sentence level errors, we've covered them. The fragment, which is the incomplete sentence, the run-on, which is two or more sentences without a correct dividing punctuation, and lastly, the comma, which is two or more sentences with only a comma as dividing punctuation. That and the comma are probably the biggest issues that writers encounter. So if you can get this down in terms of grammar, and you can understand how to generate ideas, how to draft those ideas, how to organize those ideas, and how to edit those ideas, the pieces that we've already talked about this semester, you basically have the basics that you need for writing a paper. Certainly there are other things. There is such a thing as a colon, which is what the semicolon is named after. A colon is two periods, one on top of another. A semicolon is just one period, and then on top of that, or on the bottom of that, is the comma. So we'll talk about other pieces of punctuation as the semester progresses, but this is the heart of it in terms of grammar and mechanics. And think about the writing that you've done, the journals that you've done. Have I highlighted places where you've written a fragment, an incomplete sentence? Or places where you have a run-on, where you're joining two or more sentences together without correct dividing punctuation? Or do you have a comma splice, where I would have circled the comma and indicated that you were using only a comma to separate two complete sentences? Of course, you could have other comments as well, things like spelling, which we've already talked about, or things that we will be talking about, like things like using an apostrophe. So the journals, and you should be holding on to your journals, because at the ending of the semester, we will be reviewing all of the journals as a class. But the journals are a way for you to get a sense of your own writing if you haven't necessarily had experience with evaluating your own writing. I also wanted you to read out a class. I also wanted you to practice your summary skills. So all of that is happening in these wellness journals. And for those of you who wanted to get a little bit ahead, you can see that your next wellness journal is going to be due on October 27th. So that's a week from Wednesday, today, if you're watching this video on Wednesday. Again, submit it via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, much like you've done with the previous two journals, and you also did with your first writing assignment. And this is an article about illnesses that are caused by stress. The last article was about how sleep deprivation can lead to illness, but this article talks about the specific connection between stress and physical illness, as well as emotional. So again, what you are tasked to do is to read the article. You can see the link is below, to write a summary of that article, the main points and the supporting details, and then to write your response to it. And that again will be due on the 27th, but I wanted to give you the article early in case you wanted to begin reading it early. And in terms of today's attendance question, is going to be about the sentence level errors that we've been discussing in class. The sentence fragment, the sentence run-on, sometimes known as a fuse sentence, and lastly, the comma splice. So this attendance question will be due on our class discussion forum on October 21st, which is Thursday, 10 p.m., but certainly feel free to ask me for an extension if you need it. Which error out of the sentence level errors that we've been discussing, sentence fragment, run-on, or comma splice, do you make the most in your writing, and why? So based on your own writing that you've done, either for my class or for other classes, which do you think is the one that is the most common error that you make in your writing, and why do you think you're making that particular error? Because part of this class is to be able to identify weaknesses in our writing, and everybody will have different weaknesses, so that we can work specifically on trying to strengthen that particular area in our writing. So that'll do it for today's class. As I said, I'm working on your first writing assignment. It might take me a few classes to get that back to you, but you will get it back before your second writing assignment, which I will be introducing over the next several classes as well. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about the comma. Take care. Bye bye.